"Don't speak. You're in danger." The words came out as barely more than breath against Leslie Walker's ear, but the hand that clamped over her mouth was anything but gentle. Steve Barrow's palm pressed hard enough that her designer glasses shifted on her nose, fogging slightly as her breath came in sharp bursts through her nostrils. Leslie's body went rigid with shock, then exploded into resistance. Her elbow drove backward toward Steve's ribs, her perfectly manicured nails clawing at his wrist. Behind her Italian marble desk on the 47th floor of the IDS Center, with downtown Minneapolis glittering through floor-to-ceiling windows in the frozen January darkness, Minnesota's most powerful real estate mogul was being physically restrained by her executive secretary. "Ms. Walker, please," Steve hissed, his voice cracking with desperation. His other arm wrapped around her shoulders, holding her against him as she thrashed. "Look at them. Just look." Her eyes flashed pure fury, the kind of rage that had destroyed competitors and built an $8 billion empire. She tried to speak against his palm, the sound coming out muffled and incoherent. Her hand moved toward the panic button beneath her desk. "No," Steve whispered urgently, intercepting her reach. "That'll make it worse. They'll hear. Please, Ms. Walker, just look at the conference room." Through the glass walls of her executive suite, 6 men in expensive suits stood gathered around the massive table where Leslie had been heading for what she believed was an emergency investor meeting. Cameron Hutchins, Harvard Business School rival, competitor for the Vikings Stadium District deal, frequent presence at charity galas where they exchanged pleasantries through gritted teeth, checked his Rolex with studied casualness. Leslie stopped struggling, her breath still coming hard, her body taut as a wire. Steve felt the shift, felt her attention finally following where he was pointing with his free hand. One of Cameron's associates shifted his weight, and his suit jacket fell open slightly. The overhead lights caught metal. Not a phone, not a pen, a weapon, holstered against his ribs, the kind of hardware that had no business in a corporate conference room. Leslie's entire body went cold. Steve felt it happen, felt the moment her fury transformed into comprehension. Another man reached into his jacket, checking something. Through the glass, Cameron said something that made the others laugh, but his eyes kept darting toward Leslie's office, toward the door she should have walked through 3 minutes ago. His cologne, something expensive and aggressive, seemed to permeate even through the walls. His smile was all predator, all teeth. "I heard them this morning." Steve breathed against Leslie's ear, his hand still firmly over her mouth. "At Kowalski's Market. In the coffee aisle. They're here to kill you." Her eyes, visible in the reflection of the dark windows, went wide with terror and disbelief. But she wasn't struggling anymore. She was watching Cameron Hutchins check his watch again, watching his jaw tighten with impatience, watching the way his associates had positioned themselves between the conference room and all possible exits. Steve's hands were shaking. He could feel his own pulse hammering in his throat, could smell his own fierce sweat despite the climate-controlled perfection of the office. For 3 years, he'd been invisible to this woman, the person who managed her schedule, organized her files, picked up her bulletproof coffee supplies, handled her dry cleaning. He'd been furniture. He'd been a voice on the phone and a hand that set down morning coffee without her ever looking up from Bloomberg terminals. Now his hand was over her mouth, and 6 armed men were 30 feet away, and everything he'd spent months documenting. The suspicious transactions, the overheard conversations, the pattern of sabotaged deals, was about to culminate in violence he couldn't stop by himself. Cameron's head of security, Derek Morrison, appeared in the corridor beyond the conference room. The man Leslie had trusted to protect her life was checking his own watch, nodding to Cameron, his hand resting casually on his own weapon. Leslie made a sound against Steve's palm. Not rage anymore. Understanding. Horror. "I'm going to move my hand," Steve whispered. "But you can't speak. Not yet. They'll hear. We have to." The conference room door opened. Cameron stood framed in the doorway, his expensive suit immaculate, his expression shifting from anticipation to confusion as he realized Leslie's office was empty. "Find her." Cameron's voice carried through the glass, cold and final. Now, what Steve didn't know was that silencing his boss would cost him everything he loved, but save an empire worth billions. And what Leslie didn't know was that the hand covering her mouth belonged to the only person in Minnesota who could keep her alive through the next 60 minutes. But to understand how a secretary became the only thing standing between Minnesota's richest woman and a bullet, we have to go back to the morning it all began, when Steve Barrow was just trying to pick up coffee. Before we proceed, here's a special shout-out to Steve Barrow watching from the United States. Thank you for being one of our amazing supporters and engaging with the channel. A character in the story was named in your honor. If you'd also like to get a shout-out in the next video, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from, and you'll be given a shout-out. Thank you. Now let's get into the story. 6:45 in the morning, and Steve Barrow's apartment in the North Loop looked exactly like what it was. Temporary housing for someone living in the margins of someone else's empire. The studio was clean but cramped, IKEA furniture arranged with military precision. A single framed photo of his younger brother Marcus in FBI Academy graduation robes the only personal touch on bare white walls. Steve stood at his bathroom mirror, knotting his tie with practiced efficiency. Navy blue. Conservative. Forgettable. The uniform of professional invisibility. Coffee order, dry cleaning, reschedule the Mortensen meeting, confirm catering for the philanthropy board. He muttered to himself, running through Leslie Walker's morning requirements like a checklist. His phone buzzed with her first email of the day, sent at 5:30 from her Kenwood mansion. She'd probably been awake since 4. The email contained a single line. Don't forget the coffee supplies. Same order. Kowalski's. Steve grabbed his coat and headed out into the January cold that hit Minneapolis like a physical force. His breath crystallized in the air as he walked to his 10-year-old Honda Civic, the kind of car that screamed middle management, not executive suite. Kowalski's Market in Uptown was already bustling when Steve arrived at 7:15, the organic grocery store serving as morning headquarters for Minneapolis's health-conscious professionals. Steve navigated the familiar path toward the specialty coffee section, pulling out his phone to reference Leslie's standing order. Grass-fed butter from a specific Irish brand. MCT oil, pharmaceutical grade. Single-origin beans from a boutique roaster in northeast Minneapolis that charged $28 a pound. Leslie Walker's bulletproof coffee regimen was more expensive than most people's weekly grocery budget. Steve was reaching for the butter when 2 men rounded the corner into the organic aisle. Both wore expensive suits under winter coats. Both had the kind of bearing that suggested private security or law enforcement. Steve instinctively stepped back, becoming part of the shelving, the way he'd learned to become furniture in Leslie's office. The timeline's confirmed, the taller one said, his voice low but clear in the early morning quiet. Everything's set for tonight. You're sure Morrison's on board? The second man asked. Steve's hand froze on the butter package. Derek Morrison, Leslie's head of security, the man she trusted to coordinate executive protection, to vet every person who came within 50 feet of her. He's getting $5 million to look the other way, the tall man replied. He'll disable the security feeds at 6:30. Conference room cameras, access logs, everything. And Hutchins. Cameron's bringing 5 associates. All armed. They'll be positioned as investors for the emergency meeting. Steve's heart hammered against his ribs. He kept his eyes on the butter selection, his body language projecting nothing but grocery store boredom while his mind raced. Cameron Hutchins. Leslie's Harvard rival. The man she'd beaten for the Vikings stadium deal, the competitor who smiled at charity events while his eyes promised murder. The second man pulled out his phone. Steve heard the dial tone, then Derek Morrison's voice. Talk to me. Just confirming 7 p.m. sharp, the tall man said. The Walker problem gets handled tonight. Clean, professional, she won't even see it coming. Conference rooms booked under emergency investor meeting. Derek's voice crackled through the speaker. She'll walk right in. Cameron's crew will be waiting. Steve's hands were shaking now. He grabbed the butter, the MCT oil, moving like a robot through the rest of Leslie's order. The 2 men had moved away, heading toward the exit, their conversation fading into the ambient noise of the grocery store. At the checkout counter, Steve tried to keep his face neutral while his mind screamed. The cashier smiled at him. Find everything okay? Yes, thank you, Steve heard himself say, his voice surprisingly steady. He handed over Leslie's corporate card, watching his hands tremble as he signed the receipt. The drive to the IDS center felt surreal. Minneapolis morning traffic flowing around him while he gripped the steering wheel and tried to process what he'd heard. Maybe he'd misunderstood. Maybe it was a different Walker. Maybe Derek Morrison was a common name, and this was some other security professional involved in some other situation. But Steve knew. 3 years of managing Leslie's schedule, organizing her files, listening to her phone calls while pretending not to hear had taught him to recognize patterns, to connect dots others missed. Cameron Hutchins had been circling for months, ever since Leslie won the stadium deal. Small acts of corporate sabotage, failed projects that somehow benefited Cameron's companies, a systematic campaign Steve had noticed but dismissed as coincidence. The IDS Center rose 57 stories above downtown Minneapolis, all glass and steel and corporate power. Steve rode the elevator to the 47th floor, Leslie's coffee supplies in an insulated bag, his phone in his pocket feeling like a bomb. He should call the police. He should call FBI. He should call someone who mattered, someone whose word carried weight beyond. Executive secretary reporting a suspicious conversation. But what if he was wrong? What if this cost Leslie a major deal because her paranoid assistant had misheard something in a grocery store? What if this ended his career, his reputation, everything he'd built in 3 years of professional invisibility? The elevator doors opened onto Walker Enterprises' executive suite. Steve walked past the reception desk, past the conference room where Leslie would supposedly meet her death in 12 hours, past Derek Morrison's security station where the head of security nodded at him without really seeing him. Leslie's office door was open. She sat behind her massive desk, 3 monitors displaying financial data, her phone pressed to her ear as she negotiated something that probably involved millions of dollars. She didn't look up as Steve entered. Steve set the insulated bag on the corner of her desk, beginning the morning ritual of preparing her bulletproof coffee. Beans in the grinder, water at exactly 195 degrees, butter and MCT oil measured with precision. "I don't care what Mortensen thinks," Leslie said into her phone, her voice sharp with impatience. "The North Loop development moves forward with or without his participation. Find me someone who actually wants to make money." She hung up, finally glancing at Steve as he set the finished coffee in front of her. Her eyes were sharp behind designer glasses, taking in his appearance with the same analytical intensity she applied to financial reports. "You look pale," she said, not unkindly but without real concern. "Are you getting sick?" Steve forced a smile, the same professional mask he wore every day. "Just didn't sleep well, Ms. Walker." "Take some vitamin C," she said, already turning back to her monitors. "I need you sharp today. We've got that emergency investor meeting tonight at 7, and I'll need briefing materials prepared by 5. Steve's blood turned to ice. "The investor meeting?" "Cameron Hutchins and some associates," Leslie said, scrolling through emails. "Apparently there's some urgent opportunity that requires immediate discussion. Derek Morrison set it up, said it came through proper channels." Steve retreated to his desk in the outer office, his legs barely supporting him. Through the glass walls, he could see Leslie already absorbed in her work, completely unaware that her head of security had just scheduled her execution. His phone sat on his desk like an accusation. Steve stared at it, wondering if he should call someone, wondering if he was being paranoid, wondering if his boss had just hours to live. Steve stared at his computer screen, Leslie's calendar open in front of him, and made a decision. If he was wrong, he'd look paranoid. If he was right and did nothing, his boss would be dead by 8 o'clock. He stood, grabbing a stack of file folders as cover, and walked toward the records room with the purposeful stride of someone on legitimate business. Nobody questioned executive secretaries carrying files. That was the advantage of being invisible. The records room was climate-controlled and meticulously organized. Years of Walker Enterprises confidential documents arranged in systems Steve had implemented himself. He moved to the financial section, pulling files he'd been organizing 3 weeks ago, transactions that had seemed slightly off at the time. There, the Riverside development deal. Leslie had been outbid at the last minute by a company called Nordstrom Holdings. Steve flipped through the documents, his finger tracing the timeline. The winning bid had come through 18 minutes after Leslie's final offer, which should have been sealed and confidential. He pulled another file. The downtown retail complex. Same pattern. Leslie outbid by Meridian Properties with uncanny precision, knowing exactly how much to offer to win by the smallest margin. Steve's hands moved faster now, pulling a third file. The industrial park development. This time Leslie had won. But the project collapsed 6 months later due to contaminated soil that surveys had somehow missed. The land was eventually sold at a loss to Highland Development Group. 3 companies. 3 suspicious deals. Steve pulled out his phone, fingers flying across the search engine. Nordstrom Holdings, parent company. Hutchins Capital Management. Meridian Properties, majority shareholder, Cameron Hutchins. Highland Development Group, board chairman, Cameron Hutchins. $400 million, Steve whispered to himself, calculating the combined losses. He's been sabotaging her for 2 years. His phone was already in his hand, pulling up the voice memos app. Steve had started recording Leslie's meetings 6 months ago, not for anything nefarious, but because she'd complained about missing details from rapid-fire negotiations. The recordings were supposed to help him prepare better briefing materials. He scrolled through files, looking for anything with Cameron's name. There. 3 weeks ago, Murray's Steakhouse downtown. Leslie had met with potential investors, and Steve had set his phone to record on the table while he took notes. Steve plugged in his earbuds, fast-forwarding through preliminary discussions. Then, clear as day, a voice he now recognized as Cameron's CFO, the timeline's accelerating. We need the Walker situation resolved before the public offering documents are filed. Another voice, Cameron's confident this will be handled permanently. The stadium district victory was her last. Steve's stomach turned. He pulled up his contacts, hitting his brother's number. Marcus Barrow answered on the second ring. This better be important. I'm in a briefing. Marcus, remember those financial patterns I mentioned last month? The suspicious transactions? Steve, I told you, you're not an investigator. You're a secretary who happens to be good with spreadsheets. I know, but listen. No, you listen, Marcus said, his voice sharp with familiar big brother frustration. You sent me half-baked theories about corporate malfeasance that you couldn't prove. Do you know how that makes me look bringing that to my supervisor? Derek Morrison is being paid $5 million to disable security tonight, Steve said quietly. Cameron Hutchins is bringing armed associates to kill Leslie Walker at 7 p.m. Silence on the line. Then, what did you just say? I overheard it this morning at Kowalski's. I didn't know if I should believe it. But Marcus, I've been documenting irregularities for months. $400 million in sabotage deals, all benefiting Hutchins companies. She's about to take Walker Enterprises public at a $12 billion valuation. This is his last chance to stop her. Where are you right now? My desk. 47th floor, IDS Center. Don't do anything. I'm calling this in immediately. Federal agents can be there in 45 minutes. Steve glanced at his watch. 10:15 a.m. The meeting's at 7 tonight. Then we have time. Stay calm, act normal, and for the love of God, don't try to be a hero. Steve hung up and returned to his desk, his heart hammering. Through the glass walls, he could see Leslie on another call, her hands gesturing emphatically. Derek Morrison walked past, heading toward the elevator bank. Steve watched him go, noting the unusual tension in the security chief's shoulders. The morning crawled by. Steve prepared briefing materials, answered emails, managed Leslie's calendar with mechanical efficiency while his mind raced through possibilities. At 11:30, he pulled up the email system, searching for the investor meeting invitation. The message had come from Leslie's account, but something felt wrong. Steve leaned closer to his screen, examining the formatting. The signature line was slightly off, missing the Oxford comma Leslie always insisted on. The timestamp showed the email sent at 2 a.m., hours when Leslie was always asleep. Derek Morrison has administrative access to email systems, Steve muttered, pulling up the technical specifications. Security personnel needed back-end access for threat assessment and communication monitoring. Morrison could have sent this email from Leslie's account without her knowledge. Steve opened a new browser window, searching for articles about Cameron Hutchins and Leslie Walker. The Harvard Business School rivalry went back 15 years, both graduating at the top of their class, both building real estate empires in the same market. Competition had always been fierce but professional, until the Vikings Stadium District deal. $2.3 billion in development rights for the area surrounding the new stadium. Leslie had won with a proposal that combined affordable housing with luxury retail, earning praise from city council and community advocates. Cameron's proposal, focused purely on maximum profit extraction, had been rejected. The news articles from 2 years ago showed Cameron's carefully controlled rage in press conferences. Walker Enterprises consistently benefits from preferential treatment, he'd said, his smile not reaching his eyes. This city's leadership seems determined to reward idealism over economic reality. Steve clicked through more articles, finding the 3 failed deals he'd already documented. Each article mentioned unexpected complications, surprising last-minute bids, or unforeseen problems. Each time, Cameron's companies had somehow emerged as beneficiaries. His watch showed 3 p.m. For hours until the meeting, Steve's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Briefing supervisors now. Stay safe. Don't engage. Derek Morrison returned to his security station at 3:30, his face flushed, taking a call that made him turn away from the executive suite's glass walls. Steve watched him through the transparent office landscape, noting every suspicious movement. At 4 p.m., Leslie called Steve into her office. I need the briefing materials for tonight's meeting. Cameron's proposal summary, our current portfolio valuation, comparative market analysis. Ms. Walker, Steve said carefully. Do you know much about tonight's emergency investor meeting? Who specifically requested it? Leslie frowned slightly, the first time all day she'd really looked at him. Derek Morrison coordinated it through proper channels. What? The email came from your account at 2 a.m. You don't send emails at 2 a.m. Steve, I appreciate your attention to detail, but Derek has authorization to manage my calendar for security purposes. If there's an emergency meeting that requires immediate scheduling, he's empowered to handle it. Right, Steve said quietly. Of course. He returned to his desk, watching the clock tick toward 5 p.m., then 5:30. Through the glass walls, Leslie took a call, laughing at something, completely relaxed. In 90 minutes, armed men would be in that conference room. Steve's phone buzzed. Marcus, those patterns you sent? FBI has been investigating. Don't do anything stupid. I'm sending this up the chain. Steve typed back with shaking hands. No time. It's happening tonight. He deleted both messages immediately. FBI protocol about preserving evidence forgotten in the face of immediate danger. Through the glass, Derek Morrison was checking his watch, his hand resting on his phone. Cameron Hutchins' name appeared on Leslie's calendar for 7 p.m., 6 names listed as associates. Steve stood up, his decision made. Federal agents weren't going to arrive in time. Marcus was following proper channels that moved at bureaucratic speed. In 90 minutes, Leslie Walker would walk into that conference room, and Steve Barrow was the only person in the building who knew she'd never walk out. The truth is, most of us walk past danger every single day without seeing it. We ignore the small details that don't quite add up because it's easier than confronting what they might mean. Steve saw what others missed because he paid attention when no one thought he mattered. If stories about people who refuse to look away, even when it costs them everything, mean something to you, consider subscribing. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest warnings. 6:15 p.m., and Cameron Hutchins strode through the IDS Center lobby like a man who owned the building. 5 associates flanked him, all wearing expensive suits that didn't quite hide the tension in their shoulders. Steve watched from the 47th floor security feed on Derek Morrison's unattended monitor, his stomach churning. Gentlemen, Cameron's voice carried across the marble lobby to the security desk. We're here for the Walker Enterprises investor meeting. 7th floor conference room. 47th floor, sir. The lobby guard corrected, checking his list. You're cleared through. Elevators on your right. Steve moved away from the monitor as Derek Morrison appeared from the equipment room, his face pale and slick with sweat. The head of security's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone, typing something quickly before pocketing it again. Everything all right, Derek? Steve asked casually. Morrison jumped, turning with wide eyes. Fine. Just coordinating the evening meeting logistics. You should head out soon, Steve. Long day. Ms. Walker needs me for the meeting notes, Steve lied smoothly. I'll be staying late. Derek's jaw tightened, but he nodded, moving to his security station. Steve watched him pull up the camera management system, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then, with the decisive movement of a man who'd made his choice, Derek began typing commands. One by one, the security camera indicators on his screen turned from green to red. Executive floor cameras offline. Access logs suspended. Security feeds disabled. Steve's phone was already out, camera app open and set to record. He placed it on a shelf behind a stack of files, lens aimed at the conference room, and hit record before sliding it partially out of sight. The elevator chimed. Cameron Hutchins and his 5 associates emerged, their confident smiles not reaching their eyes. Steve caught a glimpse of something metallic as one man adjusted his jacket. Not a phone, not a wallet. Something heavier, more dangerous. "Mr. Hutchins," Derek Morrison said, his voice strained with false cheer. "Welcome. Ms. Walker is expecting you in the main conference room." "Excellent," Cameron replied, his cologne, something expensive and aggressive, filling the reception area. "I hope we can resolve tonight's urgent matters quickly. Time is, as they say, money." His associates laughed at the joke that wasn't funny. Steve noticed how they positioned themselves, spreading out across the reception area, controlling sight lines and exits with military precision. In her office, Leslie stood before a mirror, adjusting her blazer. Steve could see her through the glass walls, completely absorbed in preparation, reviewing talking points on her tablet. She had no idea that 6 armed men had just arrived to kill her. Steve moved to the file room, pulling out building blueprints he'd discovered weeks ago while organizing archived documents. His hands shook as he spread them across a table, searching for anything that could help. There, a notation from the building's 1972 construction. Executive escape passage, 47th floor to 46th, accessed through maintenance corridor behind conference room. The passage was probably forgotten, sealed off decades ago, but it was something. A possibility. A chance. "Steve." Leslie's voice carried from her office. "Can you bring the investor briefing materials to the conference room? They should be arriving any moment." "Yes, Ms. Walker," Steve called back, gathering folders with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. "Right away." He approached her office, briefing materials clutched like a shield. "Ms. Walker, I need to talk to you about tonight's meeting." Leslie looked up from her tablet, impatience flickering across her features. "Steve, make it quick. I have 6 investors waiting." "Those aren't investors," Steve said quietly, urgently. "I overheard something this morning. Cameron Hutchins is here too. Cameron and I have disagreed on projects before, but he's a legitimate businessman." Leslie interrupted. "Steve, I appreciate your concern, but I don't have time for paranoia right now. Ms. Walker, please, just listen." "Enough." Her voice hardened with the authority that had built an $8 billion empire. "I need you to be professional right now. Set up the conference room, prepare the presentation materials, and take notes during the meeting. That's what I pay you for." Steve's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing Marcus's name. "I need to take this." "Make it fast," Leslie said, already turning back to her tablet. Steve stepped into the corridor, answering the call. "Marcus, don't let her go into that meeting." His brother's voice was tight with urgency. "Federal agents are en route, but they're 20 minutes out. There was an accident on 394, traffic's completely blocked. Steve, you need to get Ms. Walker out of that building right now." "She won't listen to me," Steve said, watching through glass walls as Cameron Hutchins and his associates settled into the conference room. "She thinks I'm being paranoid." "Then make her listen. I don't care if you have to physically drag her out. Those men aren't there to talk business." "How do you know?" "Because the FBI's been investigating Cameron Hutchins for 18 months. Wire fraud, racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder in 2 other cases. Steve, he's killed before. He's going to kill again tonight unless you stop it." The line went dead. Steve stared at his phone, then at Leslie's office, then at the conference room where 6 men waited with weapons hidden under expensive suits. Through the glass, Leslie stood, smoothing her blazer one final time. She picked up her tablet, her expression shifting into the confident mask she wore for high-stakes negotiations. 6:55 p.m. 5 minutes until the meeting was scheduled to begin. Derek Morrison had disappeared, presumably to count his $5 million somewhere far from the scene of what was about to happen. The security cameras were dark. The access logs were suspended. Nobody would see what happened in that conference room except the people inside it. Leslie walked toward her office door, her hand reaching for the handle. In the conference room, Cameron Hutchins saw her movement through the glass walls and nodded to his associates. They stood in unison, a choreographed movement that spoke of planning and practice. Steve saw jackets being adjusted, saw hands moving toward concealed weapons, saw Cameron's predatory smile sharpening into something deadly. In that split second, every instinct told Steve to stay silent, stay safe, Stay in his lane. Executive secretaries don't tackle their billionaire bosses. Executive secretaries don't override security protocols. Executive secretaries don't decide that their judgment matters more than their superiors. But Steve wasn't thinking about being a secretary anymore. He was thinking about whether Leslie Walker would be alive in 60 seconds. He was thinking about Marcus's voice saying he's killed before. He was thinking about $400 million in sabotage and 18 months of FBI investigation and the way those men checked their weapons when they thought nobody was watching. Leslie's office door opened. Steve moved. Would you physically stop someone you work for if you believed they were walking into danger, even if you had no proof and knew they'd think you were crazy? Even if it could cost you your job and your reputation? Tell me honestly what you would do. Steve crossed Leslie's office in 3 strides, his hand reaching for her just as she stepped toward the conference room. His palm clamped over her mouth, his other arm wrapping around her shoulders, pulling her backward with force that sent her designer glasses askew. Leslie's body went rigid with shock, then exploded into violent resistance. Her elbow drove toward his ribs, her heel stomping down on his foot with enough force to make him gasp. She twisted in his grip, her hands clawing at his wrist, muffled sounds of fury and terror coming from behind his palm. Ms. Walker, please, Steve hissed desperately, struggling to hold her. Don't speak. Don't scream. Just look. But Leslie wasn't looking. She was fighting like her life depended on it, which Steve supposed it did, though not in the way she thought. Her hand shot toward the panic button hidden beneath her desk, fingers stretching for the concealed switch that would trigger building-wide security alerts. No. Steve caught her wrist with his free hand, pulling her away from the desk. That'll make it worse. They'll hear. Ms. Walker, please, just look at the conference room. Leslie's eyes were wild behind her fogged glasses, filled with betrayal and rage. She thought he'd lost his mind. She thought her trusted secretary had finally snapped under the pressure of managing her impossible schedule. Or worse, she thought he'd been bought, turned against her like Derek Morrison. Look, Steve pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. He loosened his grip slightly, pointing with his free hand toward the glass walls of the conference room. Please, just look at them. Leslie's struggles slowed, confusion mixing with her terror. Her eyes followed where Steve was pointing, focusing on the 6 men in the conference room who should have been settling in for a business meeting. Cameron Hutchins stood at the head of the conference table, checking his Rolex with the kind of impatience that had nothing to do with business. One of his associates shifted his weight, and his jacket fell open slightly. The overhead fluorescent lights caught metal, not a phone, not keys, but something unmistakably weapon-shaped, holstered against his ribs. Leslie's entire body went still. Steve felt the change, felt the moment her fury transformed into understanding. Another man reached inside his jacket, adjusting something. Through the glass, Cameron said something that made the others nod, their expressions shifting from professional courtesy to predatory focus. His expensive cologne seemed to permeate the office even through the walls, mixing with the scent of Leslie's fear sweat and Steve's panic. I heard them this morning. Steve breathed against Leslie's ear, his hand still firmly over her mouth, but gentle now, protective rather than restraining. At Kowalski's Market. Cameron's men. They're here to kill you. Derek Morrison disabled all the security cameras. My brother at FBI confirmed it. Cameron's under investigation for murder. Leslie's eyes, visible in the reflection of the dark windows behind her desk, went wide with horror and disbelief. But she wasn't struggling anymore. She was watching Cameron Hutchins check his watch again, watching the way his associates had positioned themselves with military precision, watching weapons being subtly checked when they thought no one was looking. I'm going to move my hand, Steve whispered. But you can't speak. Not yet. They'll hear us. We need to get to the adjacent office. There's an old maintenance passage, an escape route from the 70s. I found it in the building blueprints. Slowly, carefully, Steve released Leslie's mouth. She gasped for air, her hand flying to her face, but she didn't scream. She turned to look at him, really look at him, for perhaps the first time in 3 years. Derek? She whispered, her voice barely audible. $5 million to look the other way. Steve confirmed quietly. He's gone. Cameras are off. Access logs disabled. Federal agents are coming, but they're 20 minutes out. We're on our own. Leslie's hand moved toward her phone on the desk. I'll trigger the building alarm. Steve caught her wrist. That'll bring them here immediately. Right now they think you're still in your office, maybe in the bathroom. We have maybe 2 minutes before they come looking. We need to move. Now. Through the glass walls, Cameron stood from his chair. One of his associates said something, gesturing toward Leslie's office. Cameron's jaw tightened with impatience. This way, Steve urged, pulling Leslie toward the door that connected her office to the adjacent executive suite. The space was currently empty, used for overflow meetings and storage. He'd noticed it months ago while organizing files, noticed the old maintenance corridor door that everyone else seemed to have forgotten. Leslie followed, her hand gripping Steve's arm hard enough to leave bruises, her breathing rapid and shallow. They slipped through the connecting door just as Cameron Hutchins moved toward Leslie's office. Why would he do this? Leslie whispered, pressing against the wall beside Steve. Cameron and I have competed for deals, but murder? The Vikings Stadium district deal, Steve said quietly, watching through a crack in the door. You won $2.3 billion in development rights. He's been sabotaging your projects for 2 years, for $100 million in losses. You're 48 hours from taking Walker Enterprises public at $12 billion. This is his last chance to stop you. Leslie's face went pale. The public offering. If I die before signing. Everything falls apart, Steve finished. Your estate goes to probate. The company stalls. Cameron buys up assets during the chaos. He's been planning this for months. In Leslie's office, the main doors burst open. Cameron Hutchins stood in the doorway, his expensive cologne wafting through the space, his smile all predatory confidence. Leslie, so sorry to start without you, but we really can't wait any longer. Behind him, 5 men spread out, hands moving inside their jackets. They checked corners, looked under the desk, moved with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. From their hiding place in the adjacent office, Steve and Leslie watched through the crack in the door. Leslie's hand gripped Steve's arm with desperate strength, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his skin. Cameron's smile faded as he realized Leslie's office was empty. His expression shifted from confident to concerned to coldly furious in the space of 3 seconds. Where is she? One of his associates asked. Find her, Cameron snapped, his voice losing all pretense of professional courtesy. Check the bathroom. Check the file room. She can't have gone far. Derek said the cameras are off. We're clear. Find her now. Men scattered, weapons now openly visible as they moved through the executive suite. Steve felt Leslie's entire body trembling against his. 3 years of professional distance collapsing into this moment of shared terror. How did you know? Leslie whispered, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that felt like seeing him for the first time. How did you see this coming when I didn't? I buy your coffee. Steve whispered back, the absurdity of the statement somehow perfect. I'm invisible to everyone, so I see everything. I heard them at Kowalski's this morning. They thought I was just furniture. Cameron appeared in Leslie's office again, pulling out his phone. Derek, she's not here. Where the hell is Walker? Through the crack in the door, they watched him listen to Derek Morrison's response, his face darkening with rage. Then she's still on this floor, Cameron said coldly. Lock down the elevators. Check every office. She's here somewhere, and she's not leaving alive. Leslie had built an $8 billion empire on trusting her instincts and never showing weakness. In that moment, she had to trust the one person she'd never really seen. Have you ever had to put your life in the hands of someone you'd completely underestimated? Share your experience below. Steve pulled Leslie through the adjacent office toward a door marked Maintenance Access. Authorized personnel only. The handle was stiff with disuse, but it turned. They slipped into a narrow corridor that smelled of dust and forgotten decades, pulling the door shut behind them. The passage was barely wide enough for 2 people, lit by emergency lighting that cast everything in sickly yellow. Leslie kicked off her designer heels, leaving them behind as Steve led her down concrete stairs between floors. Where does this go? Leslie whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. Between 47th and 46th floors, Steve said, pulling out his phone. Old executive escape route from the 70s, back when corporate kidnapping was a bigger concern. Most people don't even know it exists anymore. They pressed against the cold concrete wall, both breathing hard. Above them, they could hear footsteps, muffled voices, the sound of doors being thrown open. Show me the evidence, Leslie said quietly. You said you've been documenting this for months. Show me. Steve pulled up his phone, opening the folder where he'd saved everything. 3 weeks ago, Murray's Steakhouse. You were meeting with potential investors. I recorded it for your briefing notes. He hit play. Cameron's CFO's voice came through clearly. The timeline's accelerating. We need the Walker situation resolved before the public offering documents are filed. Leslie's face went pale in the dim emergency lighting. That's Richard Chun, Cameron's chief financial officer. I've known him for 8 years. There's more, Steve said, scrolling through files. The Riverside development deal. You were outbid by Nordstrom Holdings 18 minutes after your sealed bid was submitted. He pulled up the corporate filings on his screen. Nordstrom Holdings is owned by Hutchins Capital Management. Same with Meridian Properties that outbid you on the retail complex. And Highland Development that bought your industrial park after contaminated soil mysteriously appeared in surveys that had been clean for decades. $400 million. Leslie breathed, her hand covering her mouth. Steve, that's $400 million in sabotage deals over 2 years. How did I not see this? Because you were busy running an $8 billion empire, Steve said gently. But I organize your files. I schedule your meetings. I see the patterns because nobody pays attention to secretaries. We're invisible, so we notice everything. Leslie stared at him, really seeing him for perhaps the first time. You've been protecting my company for months while I barely acknowledged you existed. That's my job, Steve said simply. Or at least, I thought it was just filing and coffee. Turns out it was also corporate espionage detection. Above them, Derek Morrison's voice echoed through the floors. Ms. Walker, this doesn't have to be difficult. Just come out. Let's talk about this like professionals. Leslie's jaw tightened with fury. I trusted Derek. He's been my head of security for 5 years. 5 years of loyalty, and he sold me out for money. $5 million, Steve confirmed. I heard them discussing it this morning. He disabled every security camera, suspended all access logs, gave Cameron a clear path to kill you without any evidence. The public offering, Leslie said suddenly, her eyes widening. Steve, I'm 48 hours from signing the documents that take Walker Enterprises public. $12 billion valuation. If I die before that signing, the company falls apart, Steve finished. Estate goes to probate, projects stall, investor confidence collapses. Cameron swoops in during the chaos and buys up assets for pennies on the dollar. He doesn't just stop your success, he profits from your death. Leslie leaned back against the concrete wall, processing the scope of the betrayal. The Vikings Stadium district deal. That's what triggered this. $2.3 billion in development rights. Cameron lost, and he couldn't handle losing to me again. He's been planning this since then, Steve said. 2 years of systematic sabotage, leading up to tonight's final solution. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. ETA 8 minutes. Keep her safe. Armed response authorized. Federal agents are 8 minutes out, Steve told Leslie. My brother Marcus works FBI financial crimes. I've been sending him suspicious transaction patterns for weeks. He didn't believe me until this morning when I told him what I'd overheard. Your brother is FBI? Leslie stared at him. Steve, who are you? I've worked with you for 3 years and I don't know anything about you. You never asked, Steve said simply, without accusation. I'm just the secretary who brings coffee and manages your calendar. Why would you need to know about my family? Leslie flinched at the truth of it. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You saved my life, and I don't even know if you have siblings besides Marcus, or where you grew up, or what you do when you're not managing my impossible schedule. 2 siblings, Steve said quietly. Marcus and a sister named Rachel who teaches in Chicago. Grew up in St. Paul. I like old movies and cooking, though I rarely have time for either. My apartment has IKEA furniture and no personality because I work 80 hours a week for someone who didn't see me until tonight. Above them, Cameron's voice cut through the walls. She's not on this floor. Check the stairwells. Check the maintenance areas. She has to be somewhere. Steve pulled up another app on his phone, the one he'd left recording in the file room. I hid my other phone before everything started. It's been recording this whole time. He hit play. Cameron's voice came through clearly. Derek, I don't care what it takes. Walker dies tonight. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Make it look like whatever you want, but she doesn't leave this building alive. I've put too much money into this operation to fail now. That's a confession, Leslie whispered. Steve, That's evidence. That's prosecutable evidence. Marcus will have it in 3 minutes, Steve confirmed, uploading the file, along with everything else I've documented. The sabotage deals, the payoff to Derek, the whole conspiracy. Suddenly, they heard new sounds above them. Heavy footsteps. Multiple voices barking commands. The professional cadence of law enforcement. Federal agents. Everyone on the ground. Hands where we can see them. Gunfire erupted on the 47th floor. Not the quiet, suppressed weapons Cameron's team had probably planned to use, but full automatic fire, followed by screaming, tactical commands, more shooting. Through the walls of their hiding place, they heard Derek Morrison shouting, "Federal agents, stand down. This is a misunderstanding." His voice cut off abruptly with a sound that made Leslie grab Steve's hand and squeeze hard. "Your brother?" she asked, her voice shaking. "FBI financial crimes," Steve confirmed, squeezing back. "Been feeding him suspicious patterns for weeks. He finally believed me." More gunfire. Cameron's voice screaming something unintelligible, his words dissolving into rage and panic. The sound of running feet, emergency alarms wailing, chaos erupting across the executive floor. Then, finally, blessed silence. Steve's phone buzzed. "Marcus, clear. Coming for you. Where are you?" "Maintenance passage between 47 and 46, Steve typed back. "We're safe. Power has a way of making people invisible." Leslie saw Steve every single day for 3 years and never really looked at him until the moment he saved her life. Sometimes we're so focused on who we think matters that we miss who actually does. If you've ever felt invisible, or if you've ever realized too late that you made someone feel that way, hit subscribe. This story is for everyone who's been underestimated and everyone who's done the underestimating. We're all both. The maintenance passage door burst open, flooding the narrow space with tactical lights. Steve instinctively moved in front of Leslie, hands raised, before recognizing the FBI tactical gear. "Steve Barrow," a voice called out. "Marcus sent us. You're safe now." Steve and Leslie emerged into the chaos of the 47th floor. Federal agents swarmed the executive suite, weapons drawn, clearing rooms with military precision. The pristine corporate space had transformed into a crime scene. Overturned furniture, shattered glass, the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the climate-controlled air. Marcus Barrow appeared through the confusion, still wearing his FBI windbreaker, his face a mixture of relief and fury. He grabbed Steve in a brief, fierce hug. "You're an idiot," Marcus said, pulling back to check his brother for injuries. "When I said don't do anything stupid, physically tackling your billionaire boss qualified as extremely stupid." "She's alive," Steve said simply. "Yeah, well, so are you, barely." Marcus turned to Leslie, his tone shifting to professional courtesy. "Ms. Walker, I'm Special Agent Marcus Barrow. Are you injured?" "No," Leslie said, her voice steadier than Steve expected. "Thanks to your brother." An agent approached Marcus, speaking quietly. "4 suspects down, 2 in custody, 1 wounded and arrested." The primary subject attempted to flee. "Cameron Hutchins?" Leslie asked sharply. "Apprehended in the emergency stairwell between floors 45 and 44, the agent confirmed. He's currently screaming about lawyers and false arrest. Pretty standard for someone caught in the middle of a murder conspiracy." Marcus guided them away from the conference room, where forensic teams were already documenting the scene. Steve caught a glimpse through the shattered glass walls. The beautiful space where high-stakes deals had been negotiated now looked like a war zone. "Derek Morrison?" Leslie asked, her voice tight. "Wounded in the exchange, currently in custody and receiving medical treatment," Marcus said. He tried to claim he was being coerced, but the $5 million wire transfer to his offshore account tells a different story. They moved to Leslie's office, which had been spared the worst of the damage. FBI agents were collecting Steve's hidden phone, downloading the recordings, cataloging everything as evidence. "We'll need full statements from both of you," Marcus said. "But the recordings Steve provided are solid. Combined with the weapons we recovered and the wire transfers we've been tracking, Cameron Hutchins is looking at multiple counts of conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, racketeering, and about 15 other charges." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Minneapolis spread out in a glittering grid 47 floors below. Emergency lights flashed in red and blue. Media helicopters circled at a respectful distance, and Steve could see crowds gathering on the street to watch the spectacle. Leslie stood at the window, staring out at her city with an expression Steve couldn't quite read. When she finally turned back, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "Steve, I don't know how to. I can't even begin to." "You don't have to," Steve said quietly. "Yes, I do." Leslie moved closer, really looking at him with an intensity that felt uncomfortable after 3 years of professional invisibility. "You saved my life. You risked everything, your job, your safety, your reputation, to save someone who barely acknowledged your existence. I treated you like furniture, and you treated me like I mattered." "You do matter," Steve said. "Walker Enterprises employs 4,000 people in Minnesota. Your affordable housing projects have provided homes for hundreds of families. The community programs you fund." "I'm not talking about Walker Enterprises," Leslie interrupted. "I'm talking about me. Leslie, the person. You saved my life because you're a good person, not because I deserved it. And I'm ashamed that it took someone trying to murder me to make me actually see you." Steve's phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at the screen and went pale. "It's Sarah, my fiancée. She's seen the news." "Take it," Leslie said gently. "I'll give you privacy." But there was nowhere private in the chaos of the crime scene. Steve answered, moving to the far corner of the office while EMTs checked Leslie's vitals. "Sarah, I'm okay. Everything's fine now." Steve could hear her voice through the phone, high-pitched with panic and something else. "Fear, maybe. Or anger. No, I couldn't tell you beforehand. There wasn't time. It all happened so fast." Leslie tried not to listen, but in the confined space, it was impossible. She heard Steve's voice growing quieter, more defeated. "I understand. I know this isn't what you signed up for. The media attention, the danger, all of it. I get it." A long pause. Leslie watched Steve's shoulders slump, watched him lean against the wall for support while an EMT tried to check his blood pressure. "I love you too, Sarah. I'm sorry. Goodbye." Steve lowered the phone slowly, staring at it like he didn't quite understand what had just happened. The EMT said something about his elevated heart rate, but Steve didn't seem to hear. Marcus appeared at Leslie's elbow. "We need to talk about security arrangements. Cameron's network might extend beyond the people we arrested tonight. We're assigning protection details to both of you until we're certain there are no additional threats." "Of course," Leslie said absently, watching Steve across the room. "Whatever you think is necessary." By 3 a.m., they'd been transported to Hennepin County Medical Center for thorough examinations. Leslie sat in an examination room, giving her statement to FBI agents while doctors checked for signs of shock or injury. Through the thin curtains separating the rooms, she could hear Steve's quiet voice. "I understand, Sarah. I know this isn't what you signed up for. I love you too. Goodbye." The same words, repeated like he was trying to convince himself they were real. Then silence. Leslie stood abruptly, pushing aside the curtain before anyone could stop her. Steve sat on the examination table, still wearing his rumpled suit, staring at his hands like they held answers to questions he hadn't known to ask. "You lost her because of me," Leslie said quietly, sitting beside him on the examination table. Steve looked up, surprised to see her there. "I lost her because I made a choice. Same choice I'd make again." She couldn't handle it? The danger, the media attention? She couldn't handle loving someone who'd risk everything for a boss who didn't even know his favorite color, Steve said with a bitter smile. Her words, not mine. She said she watched the news and realized she was engaged to a stranger who'd throw himself in front of a bullet for someone who probably couldn't pick him out of a lineup. Leslie flinched. "I'm so sorry. Steve, Don't," Steve said gently. "It's not your fault. Sarah's not wrong. We've been engaged for 8 months, and I spent more time thinking about your schedule than our wedding plans. That's on me, not you. I don't even know your favorite color," Leslie said, her voice thick with shame. Steve was quiet for a moment, then smiled slightly. "Blue. Like Walker Enterprises' logo. I always thought it was a good blue." Leslie felt tears spill down her cheeks, 3 years of casual dismissal crashing down on her in this sterile hospital room at 3 in the morning. "I'm going to do better. I promise you, Steve, I'm going to." "You're in shock," Steve said kindly. "We both are. Let's just get through tonight, and we'll figure out what comes next later." Steve's fiancée couldn't handle the fallout of his heroism. She loved him, but couldn't live with the consequences of his choice. Do you think she was wrong for leaving? Was it selfish or just human? Drop your honest opinion below. No judgment either way. 3 weeks after the attack, Marcus Barrow stood at the front of an FBI conference room in downtown Minneapolis, presenting evidence to a room full of federal prosecutors, SEC investigators, and Minnesota State Bureau of Criminal Apprehension agents. Steve and Leslie sat in the back row, listening to the full scope of what they'd survived. Cameron Hutchins didn't just plan to murder Leslie Walker, Marcus said, clicking through a presentation that made the assembled law enforcement officials lean forward in their chairs. He planned to profit from it on a scale we rarely see outside of international organized crime. The screen showed a complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, and stock transactions. Hutchins had been short-selling Walker Enterprises stock for 18 months through 12 different corporate entities. Total position, $2.7 billion, betting that Walker Enterprises would collapse. Leslie's hand found Steve's arm, gripping tightly. He was going to make billions from my death? More than that, Marcus continued. We've traced bribes to 2 members of Walker Enterprises' board of directors. Richard Chun and Patricia Okoye were promised equity positions in a merged Hutchins-Walker company after your death created chaos and allowed a hostile takeover. They would have made approximately $80 million each. Steve felt Leslie's entire body go rigid beside him. Richard and Patricia? I've worked with them for 7 years. Patricia came to my mother's funeral. They left suicide notes yesterday, Marcus said quietly. Federal agents showed up at their homes with arrest warrants. They both chose to end their lives rather than face prosecution. The room fell silent. Leslie made a small sound of grief and shock. The conspiracy extends further, Marcus said, his voice hardening. We've documented a decade of corporate espionage, stock manipulation, bribery of public officials, and systematic sabotage. The Vikings Stadium District deal wasn't just a business rivalry. It was the breaking point. Cameron Hutchins decided that if he couldn't beat Leslie Walker in the market, he'd eliminate her entirely. An SEC investigator raised her hand. What's the status of Hutchins Development Group? Collapsing, another agent responded. Stock crashed 94% in 3 days as investors fled. Banks are calling in loans. His trophy wife filed for divorce in open court yesterday, claiming she had no knowledge of any criminal activity and wants to protect her assets. Steve watched Cameron's empire disintegrate in PowerPoint slides and financial charts. Everything the man had built over 20 years evaporating in the harsh light of federal investigation. 2 months later, they stood in the Warren E. Burger Federal Building courtroom, Steve's hand shaking slightly as he was sworn in to testify. The witness stand felt impossibly exposed, every eye in the packed courtroom fixed on him. Mr. Barrow, the federal prosecutor began. Please tell the court how you came to possess recordings of the conspiracy to murder Leslie Walker. Steve explained Kowalski's market, the overheard conversation, his months of documenting suspicious patterns. He described setting his phone to record meetings, not for espionage, but to help his boss with briefing materials. And on the evening of January 24th, what did you do when you realized Ms. Walker was about to walk into that conference room? I stopped her, Steve said simply. I physically restrained her and pulled her to safety because I knew those men were there to kill her. The prosecutor played the recording Steve had made. Cameron's CFO at Murray's Steakhouse. The timeline's accelerating. We need the Walker situation resolved before the public offering documents are filed. Then Derek Morrison's voice. She'll walk right in. Cameron's crew will be waiting. Finally, Cameron himself on the phone. Derek, I don't care what it takes. Walker dies tonight. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong. But she doesn't leave this building alive. The courtroom was silent except for Cameron's labored breathing. He sat at the defense table in prison orange, a stark contrast to the designer suits he'd worn to business galas, looking diminished and furious. Leslie took the stand next, describing the terror of being silenced by her secretary, the confusion and fear, then the horrifying moment she saw weapons in the conference room. How long had you worked with Mr. Barrow before that night? The prosecutor asked. 3 years, Leslie said quietly. 3 years of him managing my schedule, organizing my files, handling every detail of my professional life. And I barely knew his name until the night he saved me. Objection, Cameron's attorney stood. The witness's relationship with her employee is not relevant to. I'll allow it, Judge Patricia Martinez said. The witness may continue. I didn't see him, Leslie said, her voice breaking slightly. For 3 years, Steve Barrow documented evidence of corporate crimes, recognized patterns I missed, and protected my company while I treated him like furniture. And when armed men came to kill me, he risked everything to save someone who'd never really looked at him. Cameron's attorney cross-examined aggressively, trying to paint Steve as an opportunist who'd fabricated evidence. But Derek Morrison's cooperation testimony destroyed that narrative. The former head of security, facing his own lengthy prison sentence, confirmed every detail of the conspiracy in exchange for a reduced sentence. Cameron Hutchins paid me $5 million to disable security systems and allow access to the executive floor, Derek testified, his voice flat and defeated. He told me Ms. Walker would be eliminated and that we'd all profit from the chaos. I was promised a position in the merged company and additional compensation. I accepted because I'm a coward and a traitor. On the final day of testimony, Cameron Hutchins finally snapped. His attorney was presenting a weak defense about misunderstood business practices when Cameron stood abruptly, his chains rattling. "She stole everything from me," he screamed, pointing at Leslie. "The Viking Stadium deal was supposed to be mine. I had the better proposal, the better financing, the better plan. But the city council loved her bleeding heart affordable housing nonsense, loved her community programs, and her public relations smile." "Mr. Hutchins, sit down," Judge Martinez ordered. "No." Cameron's face was purple with rage. 15 years of competing with Leslie Walker, 15 years of watching her win deals that should have been mine because she played the game better. That Stadium District deal was worth $2.3 billion, and she took it with her idealistic garbage about community benefit. "Bailiff," Judge Martinez said calmly. "She deserved what almost happened." Cameron shouted as bailiffs moved toward him. "You can't be that successful, that perfect, that beloved and not expect consequences. She was supposed to fall. She was supposed to." The bailiffs tackled him, cutting off his words. The courtroom erupted in chaos, spectators shouting, reporters scrambling for their phones. Leslie sitting frozen in the gallery with tears streaming down her face. 1 week later, sentencing day arrived. Judge Patricia Martinez looked down at Cameron Hutchins from her bench, her expression carved from granite. "Mr. Hutchins, you attempted to murder a business rival and destroy a company that employed 4,000 people because you couldn't stand losing," she said, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "Your greed and ego left 4 men dead and countless families traumatized. You corrupted board members, bribed officials, and turned corporate competition into attempted murder." Cameron stared at his shackled hands, all his rage seemingly spent. "You will spend the next 30 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Thinking about how a secretary you probably mocked at business galas is the reason you lost everything. All assets of Hutchins Development Group will be liquidated, with proceeds distributed to victims of your corporate crimes." Cameron's face went pale. From the gallery, Leslie watched the man who'd tried to kill her led away in chains, his expensive shoes shuffling against the courtroom floor. Steve sat beside her, no longer her secretary, no longer even sure what he was to her now. Cameron lost everything, his empire, his freedom, his family, his legacy, because he couldn't accept losing a business deal. Do you think 30 years was enough? Too much? Should someone who tries to murder a rival face different consequences than someone who succeeds? Tell me where you draw that line. 6 months after Cameron Hutchins was sentenced, Leslie called Steve into her office. Not the rebuilt executive suite on the 47th floor. She'd moved operations to the 45th floor, unable to work in the space where she'd almost died. The new office had the same floor-to-ceiling windows, but felt different, safer somehow. "Sit," Leslie said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Not the position Steve used to occupy, standing with his tablet ready to take notes. An equals chair. Steve sat, still uncomfortable with the shift in their dynamic. 6 months of therapy, FBI debriefings, and media attention hadn't quite erased 3 years of professional invisibility. "I've been thinking about how to thank you," Leslie began, then laughed at her own words. "That's inadequate. How do you thank someone for saving your life? For documenting evidence that brought down a criminal conspiracy? For seeing patterns that everyone else, including me, completely missed? You don't have to. Let me finish," Leslie interrupted gently. I've consulted with the board, with my attorneys, with financial advisors. Walker Enterprises is currently valued at $12 billion. I'm offering you 3% equity as a full partner, along with the position of Chief Strategy Officer. Steve's mind went blank. I'm sorry, what? 3% of $12 billion is $360 million, Leslie said, watching his face carefully. You'd be the youngest executive in Walker Enterprises history, reporting directly to me, with full authority to shape our expansion strategy. Leslie, I'm a secretary, Steve said numbly. I organize files and buy coffee. I don't know anything about. You documented a decade-long conspiracy that our entire legal team missed. Leslie cut him off. You recognized financial patterns that cost us $400 million. You connected dots between shell companies, offshore accounts, and sabotage deals that the FBI had been investigating for 18 months without success. Steve, you're brilliant. You've always been brilliant. I was just too blind to see it. Steve stared at his hands, the same hands that used to prepare bulletproof coffee, now being offered control of a corporate empire. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Leslie said simply. Say you'll help me build something bigger than Cameron Hutchins ever imagined. Say you'll be my partner instead of my secretary. 3 weeks later, Steve stood at the Minneapolis Convention Center, Leslie beside him at a podium facing 200 journalists. CNBC and Bloomberg had cameras positioned for the announcement. The Minnesota business community packed the room, buzzing with speculation. Walker Enterprises is pleased to announce the appointment of Steve Barrow as Chief Strategy Officer and Equity Partner, Leslie said into the microphone forest. Mr. Barrow brings exceptional analytical capabilities, proven crisis management skills, and strategic vision that will guide our expansion across the Midwest market. The questions erupted immediately. Isn't he your former secretary? How does someone go from administrative assistant to C-suite executive? Is this just gratitude for what happened with Cameron Hutchins? Steve stepped forward, his voice steady despite his racing heart. I spent 3 years in a position that made me invisible, which meant I saw everything. I documented patterns, recognized threats, and protected Walker Enterprises' interests while everyone assumed secretaries don't matter. My background taught me that details matter, that being underestimated is an advantage, and that the best intelligence comes from people nobody's watching. I plan to use those lessons to make Walker Enterprises the dominant force in Midwest real estate development. The room went silent. Then a reporter from the Star Tribune raised her hand. What's your first strategic priority? Acquisition of former Hutchins Development Group territories, Steve said without hesitation. Cameron Hutchins built an empire on the backs of corrupt practices, but his infrastructure and market position were solid. We're going to purchase those assets at significant discounts and integrate them into Walker Enterprises' ethical business model. We're going to build what he tried to destroy. 2 months later, Steve stood in Martin Patrick Clothier's downtown, being measured for his first custom suit. The tailor circled him with a measuring tape while Steve tried not to think about the fact that this single suit cost more than 3 months of his former salary. The navy would complement your coloring nicely, the tailor suggested. Perhaps with a subtle pinstripe for board meetings? Steve caught his reflection in the three-way mirror. The man looking back was familiar but transformed. Better haircut, expensive watch Leslie had insisted he needed, the bearing of someone who belonged in executive suites rather than serving them. His phone buzzed with an alert. Walker Enterprises had just closed on Hutchins Tower, Cameron's signature property on Marquette Avenue, for 40 cents on the dollar. Steve's acquisition strategy, aggressive and precisely targeted, was dismantling what remained of his predecessor's empire piece by piece. 6 months after that, Steve stood with Leslie at a renaming ceremony. The massive sign reading Hutchins Tower came down in sections, replaced with gleaming letters spelling Walker Tower North. Media helicopters circled overhead, capturing Minneapolis's skyline being literally rewritten. He built this tower as a monument to his ego, Leslie said quietly, standing beside Steve on Marquette Avenue. You're turning it into affordable housing and community spaces. That's poetic justice. It's good business, Steve corrected. The tax incentives alone make this profitable, and the community goodwill positions us perfectly for future development projects. Cameron saw real estate as conquest. We're treating it as community building. Leslie smiled at his use of we. Listen to you. Chief Strategy Officer for 8 months, and you sound like you've been doing this for decades. I've been watching you do this for 3 years, Steve said. I learned from the best. His new reality still felt surreal. The modest North Loop apartment had been exchanged for a penthouse in the Carlisle residences. His 10-year-old Honda Civic replaced with a Tesla that Leslie insisted was more appropriate for his position. His entire life transformed in ways that still made him wake up confused about where he was. 1 year after the attack, Steve stood in his Carlisle penthouse at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep despite exhaustion from another 16-hour workday. The Minneapolis skyline spread out before him, and he owned pieces of it now. Walker Tower North, the North Loop Development Project, equity stakes in properties across 3 states. His phone showed his bank balance. $1.2 billion after Walker Enterprises' continued growth and his equity stakes appreciation. The number didn't feel real. Nothing about his life felt real anymore. He thought about Sarah, about the simple life they'd planned. A modest wedding, a house in the suburbs, kids someday, normal problems like lawn care and kitchen renovations. She'd called once, 3 months ago, her voice small and sad. I saw you on CNBC. You look good. Different, but good. I'm sorry I couldn't handle it, Steve. I loved who you were, but I don't know who you are now. His phone buzzed, pulling him from the memory. Leslie. Can't sleep either? This empire building is exhausting. Steve smiled despite himself, typing back. Worth it though? Ask me in another year. Meet for coffee tomorrow? I'll buy this time. Kowalski's. Steve suggested. Where it all started, Leslie confirmed. Steve looked at the IDS Center in the distance, its 47th floor windows dark now. Everything had changed in that building. Everything. Steve went from invisible secretary to billionaire executive overnight. But he lost his fiancée, his privacy, his simple life, and gained responsibilities he never asked for. If someone offered you that trade, wealth and power in exchange for everything familiar and comfortable, would you take it? Be honest. 4 years after the attack, Steve Barrow stood on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, surrounded by cameras, confetti, and chaos. At 34 years old, wearing a custom Tom Ford suit that cost more than his first car, he looked nothing like the invisible secretary who used to buy coffee at Kowalski's Market. Leslie Walker stood beside him at the ceremonial bell, her hand resting on the striker. CNBC cameras captured every angle as the exchange president made the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to welcome Walker Enterprises to the New York Stock Exchange. Debuting today at a $24 billion valuation, Walker Enterprises represents the future of ethical real estate development in the American Midwest. Please welcome founder and CEO Leslie Walker and Chief Strategy Officer Steve Barrow to ring the opening bell. The bell's sound reverberated through the trading floor. Traders applauded. Stock tickers showed WLKR surging immediately to $28 per share. Steve's expanded equity stake, now 5% after years of performance bonuses and stock grants, was worth $1.8 billion. How does it feel? A Bloomberg reporter shouted over the chaos. Going from executive secretary to Fortune 500 executive in 4 years. Steve smiled, comfortable now with media attention that once terrified him. It feels like recognition for work I was doing all along. The difference is now people are paying attention. That evening, Manny's Steakhouse in downtown Minneapolis was transformed into a celebration venue. 300 guests from Minnesota's business elite filled the private dining room. Governors, senators, Fortune 500 CEOs, the same people who dismissed Steve as invisible furniture 4 years ago. Marcus Barrow appeared at Steve's elbow, grinning widely. My little brother, the billionaire. Mom would have been proud. She would have told me not to let it go to my head, Steve corrected, accepting his brother's hug. Where's Rachel? Your sister's flying in from Chicago tomorrow, she said, and I quote, I'm not missing the chance to tell Steve I always knew he was too smart to be a secretary. Leslie took the microphone at the front of the room, waiting for silence. The woman who'd built an $8 billion empire looked smaller somehow, more human in this moment of triumph. 4 years ago, I almost died in my office, she began, her voice carrying through the suddenly quiet room. A man I'd competed with for 15 years decided that if he couldn't beat me in business, he'd eliminate me permanently. And I had no idea. I was completely oblivious, focused on deals and developments and quarterly reports. blind to the conspiracy forming around me. She paused, emotion visible on her face for perhaps the first time in public. But my secretary saw it. Steve Barrow, who I barely acknowledged, who I treated as furniture, who I paid to organize my files and buy my coffee. He saw everything. He documented evidence for months. He recognized patterns I missed. And when armed men came to kill me, he risked everything to save someone who didn't even know his favorite color. Laughter rippled through the crowd, knowing now the story that had become Minneapolis business legend. Steve could have stayed silent that morning at Kowalski's market. Leslie continued. He could have decided it wasn't his problem, that his boss's life wasn't worth risking his own safety and career. But he didn't. He saw danger, and he acted, even knowing I'd probably fire him for tackling me in my own office. More laughter, this time with undertones of respect. Today, Walker Enterprises went public at $24 billion. We employ 8,000 people across 12 states. We have projects worth tens of billions in development. And none of it, not $1, not one building, not one employee, would exist if Steve Barrow hadn't been paying attention when everyone else thought he didn't matter. Leslie's voice broke slightly. I never had children, but if I had a son, I'd want him to be like Steve. Loyal, principled, brilliant, and brave. So I'm asking you all to raise your glasses to the man who saved an empire and then helped build it into something bigger than I ever imagined alone. 300 glasses rose. To Steve Barrow. Steve stood, uncomfortable with the attention but gracious in acceptance. He caught Marcus's eye across the room, saw his brother's proud smile, and felt the weight of how far he'd come. Later, a Wall Street Journal reporter cornered him near the bar. Mr. Barrow, what do you want your legacy to be? When people tell your story 50 years from now, what do you hope they remember? Steve considered the question carefully. I hope they remember that I saw people clearly, that I treated everyone with respect regardless of their position, that I recognized loyalty matters more than hierarchy, and that being underestimated is only permanent if you believe it. And Cameron Hutchins, the man who tried to kill Ms. Walker? I hope people remember him as a cautionary tale, Steve said quietly. A brilliant businessman destroyed by his inability to lose gracefully. He had everything, wealth, success, respect, and he threw it away because he couldn't stand watching someone else win. 120 miles north at FCI Sandstone, Cameron Hutchins lay in his prison bunk, reading a Forbes article on a contraband tablet. Walker Enterprises debuts on NYSE, reaches $24 billion valuation. The photograph showed Steve and Leslie ringing the opening bell, both smiling, both powerful, both victorious. Cameron's hands shook with rage that had nowhere to go. For years in federal prison, with 26 more to serve. His empire dissolved, his name erased from Minneapolis business history, his legacy nothing but a warning about greed and violence. He thought about the secretary he'd mocked at a business gala 3 years before the attack. Some forgettable kid trailing behind Leslie, carrying her briefcase like luggage. Cameron had made a joke about secretaries knowing their place. Leslie had laughed politely. The secretary, Steve, had smiled and said nothing. Now that secretary was worth $1.8 billion while Cameron owned nothing but prison scrubs and rage. After the celebration ended near midnight, Steve and Leslie stood on the 47th floor of the IDS Center. The executive suite had been completely rebuilt, the glass walls now showing Minneapolis glittering below, Walker Tower North prominent on the skyline. Do you ever think about what you'd tell yourself that morning? Leslie asked quietly. The morning at Kowalski's, before you heard the conversation? Steve considered, looking out at the city they'd reshaped together. I'd tell myself that being invisible is temporary. Being principled is permanent. That the work matters even when nobody's watching, because eventually someone will need what you know. Leslie nodded slowly. I'd tell myself to look up from my screens once in a while. That the person I'm looking for might be sitting right outside my office, waiting for me to see him. They stood in comfortable silence, watching their city breathe and move below them. In Sandstone, Cameron Hutchins stared at his ceiling, seeing nothing but 26 more years of the same concrete. He thought about a secretary he'd mocked. He thought about an empire that should have been his. He thought about a whispered warning he'd never hear again. Don't speak. You're in danger. This story started with a secretary nobody saw and ended with a billionaire everyone recognizes. But the person didn't change, just whether people were paying attention. We all walk past extraordinary people every single day, dismissing them because of titles, positions, or assumptions. If this story made you think differently about who deserves your attention and respect, hit subscribe.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed it, please like, comment and subscribe if you are yet to. This tells me that my effort spent in making the video wasn't in vain. Thank you, you rare piece of gem.